In this episode, we'll take a look at the Tascam Portacapture X8 handheld recorder. This is an incredibly deep audio recorder. There's so much to cover. We're going to go ahead and do an overview here of my experience with it for the last 2.5, 3 weeks, roughly. We are recording this session with the Portacapture X8 and a RODE NT1 large diaphragm condenser mic, which you can see right here, into the first XLR input. That's input number 3 on the Portacapture. Okay, let's cover the pros and then the cons, give you a few notes, and then I'll give you my overall take. First up, the pros. This recorder has 4 XLR TRS combination mic or line level inputs, and it is an 8-track recorder. So it can record those 4 inputs, plus there's another 3.5 millimeter stereo input that makes a total of 6 tracks. And then of course you can record a stereo mix of all of those inputs, making for a total of 8 tracks that can be recorded at the same time. One of the headline features here is, of course, that this is a 32-bit float capable audio recorder. What does that mean? For those of you that are not familiar with that concept, I think a better term for this would be a wide dynamic range or high dynamic range audio recorder. And what that means in practical terms is that it can exceed 0 dB full scale. So normally with an audio recorder, a digital audio recorder, you have to manage your levels so that you don't top out at 0 dB. If you start hitting up against 0 dB, you'll start to get a lot of distortion. And we have another video that I'll link to over here where we talk very specifically about what 32-bit float audio is, how it works, and how it can be advantageous. Also, a little bit about when it's really useful, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into this. The recorder is capable of recording anywhere between 44.1 kilohertz, the CD quality standard, or sample rate standard, and all the way up to 192 kilohertz. So if you're really into those high sample rate recordings, you can do that with this recorder. Of course, each of the 4 inputs can be provided with phantom power, 24 volts or 48 volts, depending on what your microphone needs. That should cover the majority of microphones. And speaking of those inputs, let's talk a little bit about self-noise and a kind of a practical noise sample that I do in a lot of my reviews. This is not any sort of scientific measurement of any sort. It's just what you can reasonably expect in terms of where your noise floor will sit when you're recording in a variety of different situations. So what I do here is I went out into my studio. I have a bunch of sound blankets, very quiet space, turned off. There was a freezer in the basement over here. I turned that off and I recorded some spoken word audio. I paused for a few seconds and then bring that whole file into post, boost the levels so that they're sitting at minus 23 LUFS, which is the European broadcast standard for loudness. And then I measure that silent portion, and that is my practical noise floor. And when we did that, we found that it came out at minus 67 dB RMS max. If you don't understand what any of this means, what I'm saying here is that that's a pretty good measurement. So what that means is that when you're recording, if you're recording in a space that's quiet and you're using a quality microphone and a quality cable, then you're going to get a relatively clean recording. Is that the cleanest I've ever heard? Absolutely not. There are definitely some professional grade and other higher end, maybe prosumer recorders that do better than that, but it's certainly good. The recorder records to microSD cards, and you can record on to SDXC cards up to 512 gigabytes in size. What does that mean in practical terms? You can go over to the Tascam site under support for the Portacapture X8, and it will show you exactly how much recording time that will be for different scenarios, depending on how many inputs or recording tracks you're doing at the same time. That'll change how many hours of recording you can get. Now, what makes this recorder unique? It's the first 32-bit float recorder of which I'm aware in a handheld format with inbuilt stereo microphones. So that's what kind of makes this one unique. What's interesting about those microphones is they're very much like a lot of the other handheld recorders you've seen out there, mostly from Zoom, also some from Tascam in previous generations, and Sony makes some as well. What's unique about this one is that not only are their microphones removable, but you can also configure them in either an A-B stereo pickup pattern or XY. So one is a little bit wider than the other. XY is better if you're not sure if you're going to get any sort of phase cancellation and you don't need a really wide stereo pickup, or if you are looking for a very wide intentional stereo type of effect, then you can go with the A-B pattern and it will give you a more stereophonic type of effect. As I mentioned before, there is a 3.5 millimeter mic line input, and there is also a 3.5 millimeter line output that allows you to send audio to your camera if you need to do that. Of course, there's a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, and in our tests, we were able to drive relatively nice headphones up to 250 ohms. It was able to provide enough power to listen back nicely in those kind of headphones. So you should be able to support most headphones. Now, if for whatever reason you don't have headphones or you're trying to play back to a variety of people, at the same time there is an inbuilt speaker. It's not going to win any awards, but if you do need to play back over the speaker, that is an option as well. There is an optional Bluetooth adapter that allows you to then control the Portacapture X8 from a mobile app, either on Android or iOS. And I don't actually have it, so I wasn't able to test that, but that would be a good option for people, especially that are going to be using the inbuilt microphones a lot, because every time you touch the recorder, that transfers to the microphones as sound, handling noise. And so if you're going to be doing a lot of work with those inbuilt microphones, you'll probably want to get that Bluetooth adapter as well so that you can control the recorder from your phone. You can power the unit a couple of different ways. Number one, there is a USB-C port on there that can be used to power it, or it also has a slot for 4 AA batteries. In our tests, we were able to use 4 rechargeable lithium-ion batteries, and it powered the unit for 4 hours and 6 minutes, recording both the built-in microphones plus an external microphone using phantom power. So your power time is going to vary a little bit depending on how many microphones you're using, how many of those you're phantom powering. But overall, that gives you a sense, hopefully, for what you could reasonably expect with this recorder with AA batteries. Now, that USB-C port, which can be used for powering the unit, can also be used to connect to your computer or mobile device to record directly into those. So you can record from the Tascam directly via USB into your computer or mobile device, and that means you can use most of your favorite audio recording apps, digital audio workstations, whatever you want on that front. There is also a pre-record feature, which means that when you press the record button, it will actually capture the 3 seconds before you press the record button into the recording as well. So that's a pretty nice feature. Now, the Tascam approach is a little bit different, a little bit more traditional. You actually have to press the record button once to arm the recorder. That's not actually recording yet. It's just getting ready to record, and then press record again. So that pre-record will only capture after you go into the arm mode from my tests so far. So just something to be aware of. This is probably the biggest, nicest color touchscreen that I've seen on a handheld recorder like this. So it can be viewed in the sun. It's a little bit reflective, so it's not perfectly viewable in the sun, but the brightness for the backlight is enough that you can actually use it outdoors. So just so you're aware of how that works. One of the features of this recorder is that it's really designed to work for people who do have a background recording audio, but also for people who don't. So it has a variety of different modes. For example, it has dedicated modes for ASMR recording, voice, music, a manual mode for those that want to get in and mess with the settings themselves, field recording, and a podcast recording mode as well. So it's an interesting combination of ease of use, but also allowing you to get in and actually set all the individual settings if you want to do that as well. If you are doing podcast recording, it does have 2 sound pads where you can play back pre-recorded sounds. Very popular thing for podcast recorders now. This one's got a couple of pads, 2 of them, that you can play back pre-recorded sounds. One additional nice feature is that it does have effects that you can turn on per channel. That includes a low cut filter, a noise gate, a limiter, a compressor, and an EQ. Now, one thing important to note here, I believe these are all implemented in the digital portion of the recorder, so it's not like a limiter that you would have, like a high-end analog limiter that would prevent distortion from happening, but it'll help a little bit in terms of making your job in post-production a little easier. If you do need to mount this in whatever fashion, either on a camera or otherwise, there are 1/4-20 threads on the back as well as a shoe mount, so very much like a cold shoe on a camera. So that gives you some options there to attaching it to a camera. And then finally, as far as warranty, it does have a 1-year warranty. Now, there are a few cons. Let's go ahead and run through these. Some of them may or may not affect your particular use case, but I want to just mention these in case they do. First up, the build is almost entirely plastic. Now, I don't know how well it's going to hold up if you drop it. I suspect it seems like pretty good plastic. It seems like it'll hold up decently, but if you drop it on concrete, there's a good chance that something's going to break. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Now, I will say that this plastic is higher quality than I saw, for example, on the previous Tascam handheld recorder that I owned, which was the DR100 Mark II. This is quite a while ago. It's a pretty old one. This does seem like better quality. And that one I did drop, and there was sort of a plastic band around the edge of it, and it broke on my old one. I think this would hold up a little bit better based on what I'm seeing with the build here. One thing that you could consider a con, or at least just a warning about this particular recorder, 32-bit float recording, audio recording, allows you to record a wider dynamic range, at least in theory. The limiting factor to that is the quality of the microphone preamplifier, what is actually taking the signal from the microphone and boosting it up, amplifying it. And in this case, it doesn't seem like this is the highest quality preamplifiers. They're good, they sound okay, but they're not necessarily going to capture an enormous dynamic range. And that's going to be the limiting factor to how much dynamic range you can actually capture. What does all of that mean in practical terms for actually recording? Well, I think it's going to be okay, for example, if you're recording spoken word audio and you want to have that protection so that if things get a little bit louder, say you set your gain at a certain level, your input level at a certain level, and then someone gets louder than you expected and that audio signal goes above 0 dB, if that happens, this recorder does a pretty good job. You can actually recover some of that sound, and we'll give you a sample of that right here. Okay, we are recording now with the Tascam Portacapture X8, the RODE NT1, and I have input level set to, or input gain set to 57 dB of gain. Okay, we are recording now with the Tascam Portacapture X8, the RODE NT1, and I have the input level set to, or the input gain set to 57 dB of gain. And this is what it sounds like. I'm right up on the microphone. However, what I would say is that you still have to be careful about how you set that input level. If you set that input level too high and you're recording something that's really, really loud, you can still essentially clip the analog preamplifier. You can actually do that on something like this. So you do still have to be somewhat careful. And also, if you're trying to record a wide dynamic range, by that I mean something that's really, really, really loud, and then right in the same recording, something that's very, very, very quiet, I'm not sure that the dynamic range of these microphone preamplifiers can really handle that as well as some other higher end audio recorders. Something like, for example, the Zoom F series, maybe the F3 or the F6, and the Sound Devices Mix Pre 2 series. If you will be using this as an audio interface to your computer or mobile device, it only works in 24-bit mode in that case, or up to 24-bit mode, so you cannot record 32-bit float to your computer or mobile device, at least as of the time of this review. The included microphones pick up plenty of handling noise, so this is not something that's unique to the Tascam Portacapture X8. It's pretty much my experience with most handheld recorders is that there's not any sort of shock mounting between the built-in stereo mics and the body of the recorder itself. And so anytime you press a button, touch the screen, all of that transfers to the microphones as vibrations, and then it's picked up and recorded as sound. So if you are going to be using this as a field recorder in a handheld fashion, you're just going to need to use a very careful technique and know that when you first start the recording, that's going to make a little bit of noise. You can, of course, settle into it, but anytime you have to make a change, if you had to make a change mid-recording, that's going to be transferred as sound. Now, if you are in that situation and say, for example, maybe you set the recorder up on a stand because you're recording ambiances, if you use the mobile app, that gets you away from that issue. So just something to keep in mind. Unlike some of the more expensive recorders, which are not handheld recorders, they're usually larger format, this does not have any sort of redundant recording mechanism. It doesn't have 2 card slots, it only has 1. It doesn't have, like on the Mix Pre series, they actually have 1 SD card slot and a USB slot. So what happens in that case is you record to the SD card and then it backs up to a USB thumb drive. The Portacapture doesn't have anything like that. So if redundancy and safety of recording 2 copies of what you're doing is important to you, this recorder is unfortunately out. As I mentioned before, the screen is quite reflective. So outdoors, that makes it a little bit challenging, but the backlight is quite strong, so you can still see it. Just be aware there are going to be some reflections. I mentioned this already, but the pre-record feature really requires that you first arm the recorder, get ready for recording. I don't know how else to call it or what else to call it. It's sort of a more traditional approach to recording where you would first press the record button once to get it ready and see the levels and check your levels, and then again to actually start the recording. The pre-record will only do 3 seconds prior to the recording time when you eventually do hit the record button the second time, if you've been in that armed mode for at least that period of time. So just something to keep in mind, that pre-record is a little bit different on this recorder than I've seen it on other recorders. Still works, but just know that you have to be in that armed state before it's going to start capturing anything for your pre-record. And finally, there's one other thing that should be mentioned. Other people mentioned this to me. I probably wouldn't have found it otherwise. But when you're recording in 192 kilohertz mode, there does appear to be some sort of very high frequency hum above the frequencies that we can normally hear with our ears. So for people that are dedicated to recording in 192 kilohertz sample rates, you need to know that. If you're real sticklers and audiophiles and want the highest quality audio, I'm really not sure this recorder is for you, to be honest. Just thought I should mention that so that you're aware. A couple other things that are not necessarily cons, but things you do need to know. If you are going to be recording outdoors, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you purchase the WS11 windscreen. It's a fur cover that goes over the inbuilt microphones, and you're going to need it. If you record outside and there's the slightest of breezes, these microphones will distort when the wind blows across them, so you're going to need that windshield. Fortunately, it's not very expensive. I think it's around $35. We'll put a link down below. You can check the current price. And then finally, the price on this recorder is $499 US at the time of this review. It's quite a bit of money for a handheld recorder. So, all right, so let me give you my take on this recorder. First of all, you have to understand where I'm coming from. So everyone's use case is a little bit different. I am a corporate and education video producer, creator. And so for me, I don't use handheld recorders a whole lot. What's interesting about this recorder, though, is that it is incredibly versatile. It can do a lot of different types of recording in different scenarios. So that's really what its strength is, I would say. But for those that have a very specific niche that they're working in, it may not be the best fit for that. So let me just talk about some of those. First up, this 32-bit float audio is a pretty interesting feature, and it is useful in this implementation in the Tascam Portacapture X8. For those, especially I would say solo operators, the people that run camera, lighting, direct, have to record audio, and they're doing basically everything. In those cases, that 32-bit float can be useful if you happen to set the input level a little bit too high. When you start recording the people that you're recording, if they go over 0 dB, you'll be pretty well protected, and in post you can pull that back down. So that is a pretty nice feature. That being said, it's not necessarily the widest dynamic range recorder I've ever encountered, and certainly you have to pay a little bit more money to get up into something that does record a higher dynamic range or a wider dynamic range, like a Zoom F6. We'll see. The Zoom F3 has been announced. I haven't tested it yet, but that one might actually be less expensive than this and actually able to record a wider dynamic range. Get subscribed if you'd like to see that review when it comes. So If you're a real stickler and you're really serious about field recording, for example, I would probably suggest you look at using external microphones and a higher quality recorder like again, a Zoom F3, a Zoom F6, or a Sound Devices Mix Pre 2 series. It's also a good option for those that are kind of in the category of I'm not really a sound engineer and I want something that's fairly easy to use, but in the future I might want to, once I learn a little bit more, have more control over all of the different settings. This actually could be a really good option in that situation. One question I can imagine a lot of people asking is, should I get a Zoom H6, a Zoom H8, or a Tascam Portacapture X8? And I think that's a pretty tough question to answer, but let me give you a few insights that may be helpful in identifying which may be better for you. I would say that the Zoom recorders can power with AA batteries for a lot longer. So the Zoom H8, for example, similar setup. I was able to record over 13 hours with a single set of AA batteries, whereas with the Portacapture X8, it was a little over 4 hours. So if being able to power via AA batteries for an extended period of time is really, really important on your list, you probably should look at the Zoom recorders instead. Now, relative to the Zoom Handy Recorder H6 and H8, the nice thing about the Tascam Portacapture X8, of course, is that 32-bit float audio, so you're not going to clip under most circumstances. I would also say that the preamps are a little tiny bit cleaner on the Tascam Portacapture X8. Now, it only provides 57 dB of gain, so if you are using a dynamic microphone like a Shure SM7B or something else that needs a lot of gain, you're probably still, and especially if you're doing live sound for a live stream or some other sort of live situation, you probably will need something like a cloud lifter or a FET-head. If, on the other hand, you will be doing post-production, then 57 dB is probably good enough, and you can boost the levels in post to get them where you need them. If you're a podcaster, the Zoom H8 has more of those audio playback pads, the pads where you push a button and it plays back a pre-recorded sound. So I believe it has 4, whereas a Portacapture only has 2. So just something to know if you are a podcaster and you need more sound pads. If having microphone capsules that you can interchange that are connected to the recorder is important to you, like we have on the Portacapture X8 and the Zoom H series recorders, if being able to interchange between different microphone capsules is really important to you, maybe you want a shotgun microphone sometimes, you want stereo microphones another time, you want mid-side stereo microphones another time, probably the Zoom H series is a better choice for you. They have a lot more options and a much more mature system on that front. The Portacapture X8 and the Zoom H6 have the same number of inputs. If you need more inputs, then the Zoom H8 might be a better choice. That's where you have 6 XLR inputs, and you can actually add, instead of using the microphones, you can pull that microphone module off and add some additional XLR inputs as well. So if lots of inputs is your thing, Zoom H8 is probably a better choice. One thing I was really happy to see is that the Portacapture X8 uses a USB-C port instead of the USB micro port that we see on some of the Zoom recorders, which don't know why. The Zoom H8 came out just, in 2020, and it didn't have USB-C. I don't understand why they did that. It's nice that they put that on the Portacapture X8. So there's kind of a comparison of those two at a high level. Which one's better? I can't tell you which one's better for you, but I would say for my use cases, if I had to choose, I would probably choose the Portacapture X8. I actually did buy a Zoom H8 with my own money. If I had the choice of the Portacapture X8 today, or at the same time I bought the Zoom H8 and I could compare the two and then buy one, I probably would have bought the Portacapture X8 instead. So hopefully that's helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. If you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.